I remember the exact moment I realized I had just traded my entire life for a man who no longer saw me. I was standing outside the intensive care unit, my hand still trembling from signing the final document, the last property. The last piece of my security. Gone. 5 houses. 1 luxury car. Everything I had built over nearly a decade had disappeared in less than 72 hours. The nurse pushed the door open gently and said, "You can see him now?" I thought this was the moment everything would finally make sense. The moment all the sacrifices would feel worth it. But when I stepped inside, Daniel didn't look at me. He was holding another woman's hand. She leaned in close, brushing his hair back like she belonged there, like she had every right to touch him that way. And then I heard him whisper, weak but certain, "It's done. Everything's transferred." Transferred. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there and smiled. Because in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It changed. I remember noticing everything all at once, as if my mind had slowed time just enough to capture it. The soft beeping of the monitor, the sterile scent of antiseptic, the way the sunlight slipped through the blinds and fell across his face. And her face. She didn't look surprised to see me. She didn't even step back. She just glanced at me calmly, her hand still resting on his. Her expression unreadable, almost as if she had been expecting me. I walked a little closer, my footsteps quieter than I expected, like I didn't want to disturb something already in progress. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady, even though I hadn't slept in days. "It's me." He turned his head slowly, like the movement required effort. His eyes met mine, but there was a pause there. Not confusion. Not exactly. Distance. He blinked once, then gave a faint nod. "I know," he said. No warmth. No relief. No recognition of everything I had just done for him. Just 2 words. Before I could say anything else, the woman beside him adjusted his blanket gently and said, "He needs to rest." She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask who I was. She just spoke. I looked at her properly then. Late 20s. Maybe composed. Put together. Not a trace of exhaustion in her posture. Not a single sign that she had just lived through 72 hours of chaos. Paperwork. Phone calls. And fear. "Who are you?" I asked quietly. She smiled. Polite but controlled. "Natalie." That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just a name. I nodded slowly. Like that was enough information. Even though it wasn't, not even close. I turned back to Daniel. "Do you remember everything?" Another pause. "Most of it," he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. "You scared me," I added, softer this time. He didn't respond. Instead, his eyes flickered briefly toward Natalie, and for a second, I felt like I was watching a conversation I wasn't part of. That was when I noticed the folder on the side table. It wasn't hospital paperwork. It was too thick, too structured, neatly organized, edges aligned. The kind of folder I used in client meetings, not in emergency rooms. I glanced at it, and Natalie followed my gaze instantly. Too quickly. She reached over and slid it slightly under a stack of magazines. Her movement subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A nurse stepped into the room then, holding a chart. "Vitals look stable," she said. But her eyes moved first to Natalie. "You've been here all night." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw me. "Oh, sorry," she added quickly, turning toward me. "You must be his wife." "Must be." I gave a small nod. "I am." The nurse smiled politely and continued speaking. But something inside me had already shifted. Because people don't assume like that unless they've already seen a pattern. And whatever pattern had been forming in this room, I hadn't been part of it. I stepped back slightly, giving them space, even though I wasn't sure why I was the one doing it. "I'll let you rest," I said, looking at Daniel. He nodded again. Still calm. Still distant. "No, stay. No, don't go. Nothing." As I turned toward the door, I heard it again in my head. Everything's transferred. Transferred where? Transferred to who? I stepped out into the hallway, the door closing softly behind me. And for a moment, I just stood there, staring at nothing. 3 days earlier, I hadn't been standing in a hospital. I had been standing in a bank, begging for time. The doctor's words had been clear, sharp, impossible to ignore. If we don't act immediately, he won't make it. Not we'll try. Not there's a chance. He won't make it. And just like that, everything else had stopped mattering. I had built my life carefully, strategically, property by property, decision by decision. 5 investment homes across California. 1 luxury car I had promised myself I would never sell. No matter what happened. Security. Independence. Proof that I had done something right. And in less than 3 days, I let it all go. I called my broker and listed everything at once. All of it, he asked. Confused. All of it. I repeated. He hesitated. Jessica, are you sure you want to move this fast? I don't have time, I said. There was a pause on the line. Are you sure you trust him with this? He asked quietly. I didn't answer that question. I couldn't, because back then, trust wasn't something I questioned. It was something I assumed. The calls came one after another. Buyers negotiating, offers dropping, numbers shifting. I accepted deals I would have laughed at a week earlier. One buyer even lowered his offer at the last minute. I said yes anyway. He smiled when I signed, like he knew I didn't have a choice. I remember sitting in one closing office, pen in hand, documents stacked in front of me. My vision slightly blurred from exhaustion. The notary looked at me for a second longer than necessary. People only move this fast when they're running from something, he said casually. I almost laughed. I wasn't running from anything. I was running toward something. Toward saving my husband. Toward keeping my family intact. Toward a future I believed was still ours. When I signed the final document, the last property gone, I felt something strange. Not relief. Not regret. Just emptiness. And then my phone buzzed. A confirmation notification. The final transfer had gone through. I stared at the screen for a moment, not fully processing it. Everything was done. Everything had worked. He was alive. That should have been enough. But standing there in that hospital hallway now, replaying everything, I felt a quiet realization settle in my chest. I had just given up everything to save my husband. And somehow, I had the feeling I was the only one who didn't know what I had really paid for. I stepped out of the hospital into the cold morning light. And for a moment, everything felt too bright, too quiet, too normal for what had just happened. The automatic doors slid shut behind me, sealing that room and whatever version of my life still existed inside it, away from me. I walked across the parking lot slowly, my body moving on instinct, my mind still replaying his voice. Everything's transferred. The words didn't sound emotional. They didn't sound confused. They sounded certain. I reached into my bag for my keys, my fingers brushing against empty space before I remembered. I didn't have a car anymore. For a second, I just stood there, my hand frozen mid-motion, like my body hadn't caught up to reality yet. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and lowered my hand. I had sold it, just like everything else. I found a bench near the edge of the lot and sat down, staring at nothing in particular. Nurses passed by. A family hurried toward the entrance. Somewhere in the distance, a siren cut through the air. Life was still moving. Mine felt like it had paused somewhere I couldn't reach. I tried to make sense of what I had seen. Maybe he was still disoriented. Maybe Natalie was just someone helping. A friend. A nurse I didn't know about. Someone who stepped in when I couldn't be there. But that didn't explain the way she touched him. It didn't explain the way he looked at her. And it definitely didn't explain the word transferred. People don't whisper about money after surviving something like that. Not unless it mattered before. I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my fingers against my temple, I wasn't suspicious yet, but I wasn't comfortable either. 2 days earlier, I hadn't had time to think. I had been moving too fast, running from one closing office to another, answering calls while signing documents, negotiating numbers I didn't even bother arguing over. Jessica. They just dropped the price again. My broker had said over the phone. How much? I asked, already reaching for the next document. More than you should accept. I don't have time to negotiate, I said. Take it. There had been a pause. You're sure? No, I replied honestly, but do it anyway. I didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Every hour mattered. Every delay felt like a risk I couldn't afford. I remember walking into the dealership later that same day, handing over the keys to my car without even looking back at it. The buyer circled it slowly, checking details, asking routine questions. How long have you had it? He asked. Long enough? I said. He nodded, satisfied, and handed me the paperwork. I signed without reading it twice. When he drove away, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching the car disappear down the street. That car had been more than transportation. It had been proof. Proof that I had built something for myself. That I was stable, independent, in control. And just like that, it was gone. When I got back to the hospital that evening, Daniel was still unconscious, machines doing the work his body couldn't yet handle. I sat beside him, holding his hand, talking to him like he could hear me. I took care of everything. I told him quietly, "You just need to come back." He didn't respond. Of course he didn't. But at the time, that silence didn't bother me. It felt temporary. Now, sitting outside that same hospital, I realized something had shifted. When he had finally spoken, he hadn't said anything that belonged to me. I opened my phone, scrolling through my notifications absent-mindedly. Emails, confirmations, missed calls. And then I saw it again. The transfer notification. I tapped it this time, opening the details more carefully. The amount was correct. The timing matched. But the account information? I frowned slightly, reading it again. The name attached to the receiving account wasn't fully visible, partially masked, but something about it felt off. Not Daniel. Not me. I stared at it longer than I needed to. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a technical detail I didn't understand. But something in my chest tightened anyway. I leaned back against the bench, exhaling slowly. This wasn't how this was supposed to feel. I had just saved his life. That should have been the only thing that mattered. But instead of relief, all I felt was a quiet, creeping discomfort I couldn't explain. My phone rang suddenly, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was Daniel's mother. I hesitated for a second before answering. "Hi," I said. "How is he?" she asked immediately. "He's stable," I replied. "He's awake." A pause. "That's good," she said. "You did the right thing." The words sounded like praise, but something about her tone felt measured. "I just wanted to check in," she continued. "Make sure everything's handled." Handled. I glanced down at my phone again, at the transaction still open on the screen. "Yes," I said slowly. "Everything's taken care of." Another pause. "And the finances?" she asked. There it was. Not how I was doing. Not what I had gone through. Just that the finances are fine, I replied. "Good," she said quickly. "That's important." Important. I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly around the phone. "Is there anything else?" I asked. "No," she said. "Just don't stress yourself too much. He needs stability right now." Stability. I almost laughed. "I understand," I said instead. We hung up shortly after that. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at the screen for a moment before locking it. No one had asked how I was going to rebuild after this. No one had asked what I had left. Not really. I had made the decision alone, and now I was sitting here alone. I looked back at the hospital entrance. the glass doors reflecting the morning light. Somewhere inside, Daniel was recovering. And somewhere in that same space, Natalie was standing next to him, like she belonged there. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the silence settle around me. This wasn't just about what I had seen. It was about everything that had happened before it. The urgency, the pressure, the way everything had aligned just a little too perfectly. I opened my eyes again, a quiet realization forming in the back of my mind. It wasn't chaos. It was timing. And timing like that doesn't happen by accident. I walked back into the hospital room with my phone still in my hand, the strange transfer notification lingering in my mind like a word I couldn't quite pronounce but couldn't ignore either. The room looked exactly the same. Machines humming, soft light filtering through the blinds. The steady rhythm of Daniel's heartbeat displayed on the monitor. But something had changed. Or maybe I had... Daniel was more alert now, his eyes open, his breathing steadier. But his attention wasn't on the door when I entered. It was on her. Natalie stood beside him again, adjusting his blanket with a kind of quiet familiarity that didn't belong in a place like this, not unless you had been there long enough to earn it. No one told her what to do, yet she moved like she already knew everything. I stepped closer, my movement slower this time, more deliberate. "Daniel," I said softly. "It's me." He turned his head toward me, and for a second, our eyes met. There was recognition, but it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't relief. It wasn't warmth. It was acknowledgement. "I know," he said. Just like before. 2 words. Flat. Distant. Controlled. Before I could respond, Natalie gently placed her hand over his again, her fingers resting against his like it was the most natural thing in the world. "He shouldn't talk too much," she said calmly. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. I studied her more closely this time. Late 20s. Composed. Not a single sign of exhaustion. Not a crease in her clothes. Not a shadow under her eyes. She looked like someone who had prepared for this moment. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice steady. This time, she turned to face me fully. "Natalie," she said, offering a small, controlled smile. "We go back a long way."
We.
The word settled somewhere deeper than it should have. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch for a second longer than necessary. "Do you remember everything?" I asked Daniel, my eyes still on him. He hesitated, not confused, not searching, just choosing most of it, he said finally. "Most." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't let it show. "You scared me," I said quietly. Again. Nothing. No apology. No reassurance. Just that same calm, distant presence. And then it happened again. His eyes shifted briefly, subtly, toward Natalie. It was quick, almost nothing. But it was enough. Enough to tell me I wasn't part of whatever they weren't saying. I glanced around the room, letting my eyes move naturally, like I wasn't looking for anything specific. That's when I saw it. The folder. It sat on the small side table, partially tucked beneath a stack of magazines. Clean edges. Structured. Not hospital-issued. It didn't belong here. I took a step closer, just enough to see the corner of it more clearly. Natalie moved instantly. Too fast. She reached over, adjusting the magazines casually, sliding the folder further underneath them in a motion so smooth it would have gone unnoticed, if I hadn't already been watching. I didn't react. I just looked back at Daniel. "Do you need anything?" I asked. He shook his head slightly. "I'm fine." Fine. The word felt misplaced in a room like this. A nurse stepped in a moment later, holding a chart. "Vitals are stable," she said, glancing at the monitor before looking up. Her eyes went straight to Natalie. "You've been here all night." She stopped mid-sentence when she noticed me. A flicker of realization crossed her face. "Oh," she added quickly, shifting her attention. "You must be his wife." "Must be?" I gave a small nod. "I am..." The nurse smiled politely, continuing with her routine. But the moment had already passed. People don't make assumptions like that without context, without patterns, without seeing something more than once. I stepped back slightly, giving them space again, even though I didn't understand why I was the one doing it. "I'll let you rest," I said. Daniel nodded. Again, no hesitation, no resistance, no stay. I turned toward the door, my hand resting lightly on the handle before I paused. "Everything's transferred." The words echoed again, sharper this time. Transferred where? Transferred to who? I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, letting it close behind me with a soft click. The noise from inside disappeared instantly, replaced by the distant sounds of hospital life. Footsteps, voices, machines. I leaned against the wall for a second, pulling my phone out again without thinking. The notification was still there, unread, unresolved. I opened it again, this time paying closer attention to the details. Amount, timestamp, routing information. And then, the name, partially masked, but visible enough. Not Daniel, not me. Something about it felt familiar, like a word on the tip of my tongue. I stared at it longer than I should have, my mind trying to connect it to something, anything that made sense. And then, without warning, a memory surfaced. Natalie. The way she stood in the room. The way she reacted to that word. Transferred. I lowered the phone slowly, my breath catching just slightly in my chest. That was the first time I connected her face to something outside that hospital room. I pushed myself off the wall, straightening my posture. I wasn't panicking. Not yet. But something had shifted. Something quiet. Something precise. I walked down the hallway slowly, my steps measured, my mind already moving ahead of me. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask what I had done. He asked one thing. Did everything go through? Not concern. Confirmation. I stopped walking for a moment, the realization settling deeper this time. That wasn't a question someone asks unless they're expecting an answer. Unless they're waiting for something to be completed. I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening slightly around my phone. That was the first moment I understood something I couldn't ignore anymore. I wasn't standing in the middle of a situation I didn't understand. I was standing just outside of something that had already been set in motion. And whatever it was, I hadn't been the one in control of it. I didn't remember the drive home. One moment I was walking out of the hospital. The next I was standing in my living room, keys in my hand that didn't belong to me anymore, surrounded by silence that felt too heavy to ignore. The house looked exactly the same. The couch, the framed photos, the faint scent of the candle I used every evening. But something felt off. Not broken, not missing, just shifted. I stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind me with a soft click, listening to the quiet settle around me. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was coming home. I felt like I was stepping into a place I didn't fully understand anymore. I set my bag down and walked toward the kitchen, moving out of habit more than intention. My eyes scanned the space without really focusing. But then something caught my attention. A glass in the sink, half full of water. I didn't remember leaving it there. I frowned slightly, trying to recall when I had last been home long enough to use a glass at all. I stepped closer, touching it lightly. Cold. Not recent, but not old either. I turned away, shaking the thought off. It was nothing. Probably nothing. But as I moved through the house, more small details began to surface. A chair slightly out of place. A cabinet door not fully closed. A faint scent that didn't belong to anything I owned. Not strong enough to name, but present. Nothing was missing. But something had definitely been there. I paused in the middle of the living room, my arms crossing slowly as I looked around again, this time with intention. I wasn't searching for answers yet. I was noticing, and the more I noticed, the more one thought began to take shape in my mind. You don't walk into someone else's life that confidently unless you've already been living in it. I exhaled quietly and moved toward my office. Daniel's laptop sat exactly where I had left it. Closed. Unmoved. Ordinary. I pulled the chair out and sat down, opening it slowly. My fingers steady even though something in my chest felt tight. The screen lit up. No password prompt. Still logged in. At first glance, everything looked normal. Emails. Documents. The usual layout. But I didn't look at the obvious. I looked at what wasn't supposed to be obvious. I opened the email client and checked the folders. Inbox. Sent. Drafts. Then I clicked on trash. Empty. Too empty. I leaned back slightly, staring at the screen. He had deleted something. Not casually. Intentionally. I moved to the browser history next. Cleared. Every tab. Every search. Gone. I let out a slow breath, my lips pressing together as my eyes moved back to the desktop. He had erased everything, except what he didn't know I could still see. I opened a synced folder, one most people forgot about. Cloud backup. Fragments remained. Not full conversations. Not complete files. But enough. I clicked on one email thread that hadn't been fully removed. The subject line meant nothing at first. But the content... My eyes scanned the text slowly. Short messages. Precise. No emotional language. No personal details. Just structure. Timing. Final step. After recovery. I felt something shift in my chest. Not sharp. Not sudden. Just certain. This wasn't an affair. This read like a plan. My phone buzzed suddenly, pulling me out of the moment. I glanced at the screen. Daniel's mother. I hesitated for a second, then answered. Hi, I said. How is he? She asked immediately. He's stable, I replied. He's awake. That's good, she said. That's very good. Her tone was calm, measured, not relieved, not emotional, controlled. I wanted to make sure everything is handled, she added. Handled. The word settled into the same place as transferred. Yes, I said slowly. Everything is taken care of. A pause. And the finances? She asked. I didn't answer right away. I looked back at the laptop screen, at the half-deleted thread still open in front of me. Then I said, They're fine. Good, she replied quickly. That's what matters. What matters? I closed my eyes briefly, my grip tightening slightly around the phone. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask what I had gone through. Just that, is there anything else? I asked. No, she said. Just try not to overthink things. He needs stability right now. Stability. I almost smiled. I understand, I said. We hung up. I lowered the phone slowly, placing it on the desk beside me. No one had offered help. No one had questioned anything. No one had asked what I had left after all of this. I had made every decision alone. And now, I was sitting here, alone, trying to understand something that felt like it had already been decided without me. I turned back to the screen, rereading the fragments again. Timing. Final step. After recovery? My mind began to connect the pieces. Daniel's urgency. The broker's warning. Natalie's presence. The transactions. The emails. Individually. They could have meant nothing. Together. They formed something else entirely. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting toward the ceiling as I let the thought settle. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't coincidence. It was structure. It was timing. And timing like that doesn't happen by accident. I sat there for a long moment. The silence in the room no longer empty, but filled with something sharper, clearer. I wasn't asking myself what was wrong anymore. I wasn't trying to explain it away. That part of me had already faded. In its place was something else. Something quieter, more precise. I looked around the room one more time, taking in every detail again. But this time not as a homeowner, as an observer. That night, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. and started asking, who had planned it? I woke up still wearing the same clothes from the night before. My body stiff from sleeping on the couch and my mind already moving before I even opened my eyes. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I remembered. The hospital. Natalie. The word transferred. My eyes opened slowly, staring at the ceiling as the silence of the house pressed in around me. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt focused. I pushed myself up, walking toward the kitchen out of habit, pouring a cup of coffee I didn't really want. The smell filled the room, familiar but distant, like something from another life. I wasn't grieving anymore. I was observing. I carried the cup into my office and sat down, opening my laptop with a calm I didn't recognize as my own. For the first time in days, I wasn't rushing. I wasn't reacting. I was looking. I logged into my financial dashboard, the interface loading slowly as if it needed time to catch up to everything that had happened. Numbers filled the screen. Transactions. Transfers. Confirmations. Everything looked correct at first glance. It always does. I leaned forward slightly, narrowing my focus. I didn't look for totals. I looked for patterns. Numbers don't lie, but they do hide things when someone wants them to. I scrolled through the transactions from the last 72 hours, following the movement of money step by step. Incoming wires from the property sales. Outgoing transfers authorized in between calls. Signatures. Exhaustion. Everything lined up. Almost. Then I saw it. Not a large transfer. Not anything that would raise immediate concern. But repeated. Small amounts. Spaced out. Routed through intermediary accounts. I clicked into one. Then another. Then another. Same structure. Same destination pattern. Someone had broken the money apart, like they didn't want it traced back in one piece. I sat back slowly, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard as the realization settled. This wasn't random. This was designed. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. I glanced at it. An email. From one of my longest-standing clients. I opened it without thinking. Jessica. Due to recent developments, we're going to pause our engagement for now. Pause. The word sat there on the screen, heavier than it should have been. No explanation. No details. Just timing. Perfect timing. I stared at the message for a moment, then closed it quietly. It wasn't just my personal life collapsing. Something was quietly hitting my business too. I looked back at the financial dashboard, my attention sharpening. Pressure from multiple directions. At the exact same moment, I leaned forward again, reopening one of the smaller transactions, this time expanding every detail available. Routing number, timestamp, account identifier, and then a name, partially visible, masked, but enough to recognize the structure. Not Daniel. Not me. I froze for a second, my eyes fixed on the screen. I had seen that name before. Not clearly, not recently, but somewhere. It hovered just out of reach, like a memory that refused to fully surface. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to place it. A conversation. A document. A voice. Nothing solid. Just a feeling. I opened my eyes again and clicked into the next transaction. Same pattern. Same partial name. Repeated. Deliberate. My chest tightened slightly. Not from fear, but from something else. Recognition. Not of the name itself, but of what it meant. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill the room again. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was structure. I picked up my phone and dialed the bank, my voice calm when the representative answered. I just need to confirm a recent transfer, I said. She pulled up my account. Her tone professional. Routine. Yes. I see the transaction, she said. What would you like to verify? The receiving account, I replied. Can you confirm if it's been used before? There was a brief pause as she checked. Yes, she said slowly. This account has been linked before. My grip on the phone tightened slightly. Linked how? I asked. Previously connected through prior transaction activity, she replied carefully. Would you like a full report? No, I said quickly. That's fine. Linked before. But not by me. I ended the call and set the phone down, my mind already moving ahead. I stood up, pacing slowly across the room. Each step measured, Daniel's voice echoed again in my head. Did everything go through? Not worry. Not curiosity. Expectation. He wasn't asking. He was checking. He had been waiting for a result, and I had given it to him. I stopped in the middle of the room, my eyes drifting toward the window. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting a different angle across the floor. Time was moving, whether I kept up or not. I exhaled slowly, letting everything settle into place. The broker's warning, the rushed sales, the hidden transactions, the repeated account, Natalie's presence, Daniel's question. Individually, they could be explained together. They couldn't. Coincidences don't repeat in patterns. Plans do. I walked back to the desk and closed the laptop gently, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at myself. Not broken, not confused, just aware. I didn't know everything yet, but I knew enough. Enough to understand that this hadn't started with the surgery. Enough to realize that whatever was happening had already been in motion before I ever signed those papers. Before I ever sold anything. Before I ever stepped into that hospital. I had thought I was responding to a crisis. But now, it felt like I had walked straight into something that had been waiting for me. I picked up my phone again, glancing at the transaction one last time. That name, still incomplete. Still unanswered. But no longer meaningless. I set the phone down slowly, my mind already shifting forward. That was the moment I stopped trying to understand what they had done, and started preparing for what I was going to do next. It was past midnight when I finally stopped pretending I could sleep. The house was silent, but my mind wasn't. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, the only light in the room casting a narrow circle across the surface, everything else fading into shadow. For the first time since this began, I wasn't overwhelmed. I was focused. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for proof. I pulled Daniel's laptop closer and opened it again, this time without hesitation. No second guessing. No emotional weight attached to what I might find. Just intention. I moved past the obvious folders, past the cleaned-out email threads, past the erased browser history. Those weren't mistakes. They were deliberate, which meant the real information wouldn't be in plain sight. I opened the synced cloud directory again, this time digging deeper, moving through subfolders that looked too generic to matter. One caught my attention. It had no meaningful name. Just a neutral label, something forgettable. That made it stand out. I clicked on it. Inside were files that didn't belong to daily life. Not personal photos. Not work documents. Structured files. Drafts. Templates. Legal language. My breath slowed as I opened the first document. Terms. Clauses. Allocations. Then I saw it. Trust allocation. Guardianship structure. I didn't react immediately. I just kept reading, line by line. Slowly, carefully. No one drafts documents like this overnight. This had been prepared long before Daniel ever stepped into that hospital. I opened another file, then another, each one adding another layer. And then I found the one that mattered. A draft trust document. My name wasn't there. Not once. I scanned it again, just to be sure. Nothing. But my son's name was there. Clear, central, defined. And then I saw the controlling party. Not Daniel. Not me. Natalie. My fingers went still on the keyboard. They weren't just moving money. They were moving my child's future out of my hands. I leaned back slowly, my eyes still fixed on the screen as the weight of that settled in. This wasn't about betrayal anymore. This wasn't about a marriage falling apart. This was about removal. Not just from a relationship, from a role, from a position, from a life. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to replace me. I closed my eyes for a second, but there were no tears waiting there. Just clarity. I opened them again and kept going. There was more. There always is. I moved into the communication logs, digging through fragments of messages that hadn't been fully erased. Short lines, carefully worded. Nothing emotional. Nothing personal. Just coordination. After recovery, final step. She won't question it. Once she signs, I stared at those words longer than I should have. I hadn't been manipulated into helping. I had been positioned to. Every decision I thought I made under pressure had already been accounted for. I scrolled further, my breathing steady, my mind mapping connections without hesitation now. Another file. Different structure. Medical adjacent language. I opened it. It wasn't a medical record. It was a request. A preliminary psychological evaluation. Language framed around concern. Stress. Emotional instability under pressure. Recommendations for further review. Custody considerations. I felt something shift inside me. Not sharp. Not sudden. Just final. They weren't going to fight me for my son. They were going to prove I didn't deserve him. I leaned back again, my chair creaking slightly in the quiet room. For a moment, I said nothing. Did nothing. I just sat there, letting the full picture settle into place. The transactions, the trust structure, the psychological setup, Natalie's presence, Daniel's urgency. It wasn't fragmented anymore. It was complete. Daniel didn't get sick and then make bad decisions. He got sick in the middle of something that had already been planned, something that had already been moving, and I had stepped right into it. I closed the laptop slowly, my hand steady, my expression unchanged. No anger, no panic, no confusion. Just understanding they had planned everything, every step, every outcome, every reaction they expected from me. Everything, except one thing. I stood up from the table and walked slowly across the room, the floor cool beneath my feet. They expected me to react, to confront, to break, to lose control. I wouldn't confront them. I wouldn't ask questions. I wouldn't show them anything. I would stay exactly where they expected me to be, because the safest place to hide is where they think they already understand you. I returned to the table and opened the laptop again. But this time I wasn't reading. I was copying every file, every fragment, every piece of evidence. I transferred everything onto a separate drive, organizing it carefully, methodically. This wasn't about discovery anymore. This was about preservation, about control, about timing. When I was done, I closed the laptop and sat there for a moment longer, staring at the dark screen. The reflection staring back at me didn't look the same. Not because I had changed physically, but because something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the woman they had planned around anymore. I wasn't the variable they had accounted for. That night, I stopped being the person they thought they could remove, and became the only person who knew exactly how their plan would end. I woke up the next morning feeling something I hadn't felt in days. Clarity. Not relief. Not peace. Just a quiet, steady understanding of what I needed to do next. The house was still the same, but I moved through it differently now. Every step felt deliberate, every action measured. I made coffee, checked my phone, answered a few emails, all the things I would normally do, except none of it was normal anymore. Grief makes you weak, but clarity makes you dangerous. I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window for a moment, studying the woman staring back at me. She didn't look broken. She didn't look overwhelmed. She looked calm, and that was exactly what they expected. So I gave it to them. I got dressed, chose something simple, neutral, nothing that drew attention, not too formal, not too casual, just enough to blend into whatever version of me they had already decided existed. Then I picked up my bag and headed back to the hospital. The hallway felt familiar this time. Less intimidating. Less chaotic. More controlled. I pushed the door open and stepped inside Daniel's room. He was awake, sitting up slightly, his color better than the day before. Natalie was there. Of course. Standing close to him, her posture relaxed, like she belonged in that space. I smiled. Not forced. Not exaggerated. Just enough. "Hey," I said softly. "How are you feeling?" Daniel looked at me, and for the first time since the surgery, I saw something close to relief in his expression. "I'm okay," he said. "Better." "That's good," I replied, setting my bag down. "That's all that matters right now." I turned to Natalie and gave her a small nod. "Thank you for being here with him." Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I did. "You're welcome," she said. Her tone polite, but cautious. She didn't trust my calm, and she was right not to. I moved closer to the bed, adjusting Daniel's pillow gently, mirroring the same kind of behavior she had shown before. "Everything's taken care of," I said quietly. "You don't need to worry about anything." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing just a little. "Did everything go through?" he asked. There it was again. That same question. That same focus. "Yes," I said, meeting his eyes. "Everything went through," he exhaled. A subtle release of tension. And just like that, I confirmed what I needed to know. I gave him exactly what he needed, so he wouldn't question anything I was about to do. I stayed for a while longer, talking lightly, asking about his recovery, avoiding anything emotional, anything confrontational. Natalie watched me the entire time. Not openly, but carefully, measuring, trying to understand what had changed. I didn't give her anything. Not yet. When I left the hospital, I didn't go home. I drove straight to a different part of the city, parking a few blocks away from a small office building I had never visited before. My attorney's office. Not the one Daniel knew. Not the one tied to any of our previous financial dealings. A separate one. Private. Unconnected. I walked in, my posture steady, my expression neutral. "I have a situation," I said simply when I sat down across from him. He listened. Carefully. I didn't tell him everything. Just enough. The transactions. The partial documents. The trust structure. The name. He didn't interrupt. Didn't question my interpretation. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "Not if." "How long?" "They've built something," I said quietly. "I just don't know how far it goes yet." He nodded slowly. "If what you're describing is accurate," he said, "this isn't just financial manipulation." "I know," I replied. "They're building a legal position," he continued. "One that could isolate you financially and weaken your claim as a parent." I didn't react. I already knew. "They're not just trying to leave you," he added. "They're trying to replace you." The words settled into the room. Heavy but unsurprising. I met his gaze. "Then I need to know how to stop them." He studied me for a moment longer, then leaned forward. "You don't stop something like this by reacting," he said. "You stop it by documenting everything and controlling your position before they act." "Tell me what I need," I said. We spent the next hour outlining it. Evidence. Documentation. Behavior. Every step calculated. Every move intentional. When I left his office, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt prepared. On the way home, I made one more call. A number I hadn't dialed in years. He answered on the third ring. "Jessica, I need your help," I said. A pause. "With what?" "Tracing money," I replied. Another pause. Then, "Send me what you have." No questions. No hesitation. Sometimes the most valuable allies are the ones no one knows you still have. That night, I returned home and moved through the house differently. Not as someone living in it, but as someone studying it. I adjusted my behavior. Slightly. Subtly. Fewer questions. More agreement. More calm. I became predictable. Exactly the way they expected me to be. Because the moment they stopped watching me closely was the moment I would see everything. I sat down at the dining table again. The same place where everything had started to come together. But this time, I wasn't searching. I was organizing documents, notes, timelines, every piece falling into place. I thought about Daniel, about what we had been, about what I thought we had been. And then I let it go. Not emotionally. Just logically. You can't save something that was already being dismantled behind your back. I looked down at the files in front of me, my reflection faint in the dark surface of the table. That was the day I stopped being Daniel's wife and became the only person in the room who knew exactly how this would end. I sat across from my attorney again, but this time I wasn't asking questions. I was presenting a plan. The documents were neatly organized in front of me. Transaction logs, fragments of emails, the trust draft, the evaluation request. Everything aligned in a way that no longer felt chaotic. It felt structured, deliberate. He flipped through the pages slowly, his expression shifting with each section, until he finally looked up at me. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Not what I should do." "What I wanted. I want them to finish what they started," I said calmly. He didn't react right away. Then he nodded once. "Then you don't interrupt," he said. "You observe. You document. And you let them commit." That was exactly what I was planning. You don't stop a plan like that halfway. You let it reveal itself completely. I left his office with a clearer direction than ever before. Not defensive. Not reactive. Intentional. Back home. I turned my dining table into a workspace. Laptop open. Files spread out. Phone beside me. Recording timestamps. Noting patterns. I started with the financial logs again. This time, not just reviewing them, but mapping them. Every incoming transfer. Every outgoing movement. Every repeated structure. I sent everything to the one person I trusted to see what I couldn't. "Within hours," he responded. "This isn't random," he said over the phone. "It's layered. They're moving money through multiple points before it lands." "Can you trace it?" I asked. "Partially," he replied. "But whoever set this up knew what they were doing. Engineered." That word stayed with me long after the call ended. This wasn't just hidden. It was designed. The next day, I returned to the hospital. Same calm expression. Same steady tone. Same version of me they had already accepted. Daniel looked more comfortable now. Sitting up. Talking more easily. Natalie was there. As expected. I smiled as I walked in. "How are you feeling today?" I asked. "Better," he said. "A lot better." "That's good," I replied, setting my bag down. I stayed close enough to observe, but not close enough to interrupt. I let them lead the rhythm. That was the key. The more comfortable they felt, the more they started saying out loud, "I've been handling everything on my end," I said casually at one point. "Paperwork, finances, all of it." Daniel nodded quickly. "Good. That's important," he said. Too quickly. Natalie's eyes flicked toward him, then back to me. "It's just a lot to manage," I added lightly. "But everything should be secure now." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Natalie spoke first. "We'll make sure it is," she said smoothly. The correction was subtle, but it was there. They weren't perfectly aligned, and that meant pressure. I watched them closely, noting every glance, every pause, every shift in tone. They were working together, but not seamlessly, and cracks like that don't stay hidden for long. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. An email notification. I opened it immediately. A formal request. Scheduled psychological evaluation. My name. My case. Filed under family-related review. I stared at the screen, my expression unchanged. They weren't waiting anymore. They were moving to the next phase. I forwarded the email to my attorney without hesitation. He called within minutes. "We expected this," he said. "I know. We'll prepare a counter-evaluation. Document everything. Stay consistent." "I already am." There was a brief pause on the line. Then, "Good," he said. "If they want to test me," I replied quietly, "I'll be ready." That night, I made another adjustment. Not to what I knew, but to how I watched. I installed small monitoring tools around the house. Nothing invasive. Nothing obvious. Just enough to track presence. Timing. Movement. I didn't need conversations. I needed patterns. And patterns always reveal more than words. Over the next 2 days, I started noticing it. Natalie's visits. Late evening. Extended time. Moments when Daniel's phone activity increased. When files were accessed. When communication spiked. They were more careful during the day. But at night, they forgot I was watching. I sat at the table again, reviewing everything, connecting timelines with behavior. Their plan was strong, carefully built, legally structured, emotionally positioned. But it had one weakness, one assumption. It depended on who they thought I was. They believed I would stay passive, that I wouldn't question, wouldn't investigate, wouldn't act. They were wrong. The moment you react, you lose control of the story. So I didn't react. I stayed exactly where they expected me to be. And I let them continue. I let the documents move forward. Let the conversations happen. Let the structure build. Because stopping them too early would protect them. Letting them continue would expose everything. By the end of the week, I knew what I needed to know. Not just what they were doing, but when they were going to act next. And where. I closed my laptop slowly. The room quiet again, but no longer empty. Everything was in place. Not by accident, by design. They believed they were one step ahead. They believed they were moving toward something inevitable. They didn't know. I had already decided exactly where they would fall. The morning of the evaluation felt too quiet. Not peaceful. Controlled. I stood in front of the mirror a little longer than usual, adjusting my collar, smoothing out the fabric of my blouse, making sure there was nothing about me that could be interpreted the wrong way. Neutral, composed, stable. That was what they expected to test. That was what I was going to give them. By the time I arrived at the office, Daniel was already there. Natalie was with him. Of course she was. They were sitting side by side in the waiting area, their posture relaxed, their expressions calm. Not nervous, not uncertain. Prepared. They weren't surprised to see me. They were waiting for me. I walked toward them with a steady pace, offering a small nod as I approached. "Morning," I said. Daniel gave a brief smile. "Hey." Natalie didn't smile. She studied me, carefully, measuring something she couldn't quite place. The evaluator called us in shortly after. The room was simple. Neutral colors. Minimal decoration. Designed to feel safe. But nothing about it felt neutral. Not to me. We took our seats. Daniel spoke first. He didn't hesitate. He didn't stumble. He spoke like someone who had already rehearsed this moment. "She's been under a lot of stress lately," he said calmly. "Everything happened so fast. The surgery, the finances, it's been overwhelming." I listened, quietly. "She's been doing her best," he continued. "But I'm concerned about how she's handling it." Concerned. The word was placed perfectly. Not accusatory. Not aggressive. Reasonable. Carefully constructed. I kept my expression steady. No reaction. No interruption. Natalie spoke next. Her tone was softer. Measured. "She's been through a lot," she said. "And I think Daniel just wants to make sure everything stays stable. Especially for the child. The child. Not my son. The child." I felt something tighten in my chest. But I didn't let it reach my face. She continued, her voice calm. "I've been around to help during recovery. Just to make sure things don't become too overwhelming. Around. Help." Every word was chosen. Every implication placed exactly where it needed to be. She wasn't saying she was replacing me. She was making it sound like it had already happened. The evaluator nodded, taking notes, her expression neutral. Then she turned to me. "How have you been managing everything?" she asked. The question was simple, but it wasn't. It was structured, framed, designed to pull something out of me. I answered calmly. "I've been focused on keeping things stable," I said. "Making sure Daniel recovers. Making sure our home stays consistent. No hesitation. No emotional edge. Just clarity." She asked another question. "Have you felt overwhelmed at any point?" "Yes," I said. "Anyone would..." But I've managed it. Not denial. Not exaggeration. Just truth. Every question that followed felt the same. Neutral on the surface. Directed underneath. About stress. About decision-making. About emotional responses. Every answer I gave stayed consistent. Clear. Measured. Grounded. They were waiting for me to break. I had already decided I wouldn't. At one point, Daniel spoke again. "I just want what's best for our son," he said. Our son. Now it was ours again. "Convenient," he continued. "I think stability is the most important thing right now." Stability. The same word his mother had used. The same word Natalie had implied. The same word they were building their case around. I glanced at Natalie briefly. She didn't look at me. But I saw it. A flicker. A moment where her expression shifted just slightly. Something in what Daniel said didn't align perfectly with what she expected. It was small. Almost invisible. But it was there. For a second, the story they built slipped just enough to show it wasn't solid. The evaluator noticed it too. Just a brief pause. A shift in her attention. Then she continued. The session went on like that for what felt longer than it probably was. Questions. Answers. Observations. All carefully contained within a structure that had been set long before I walked into that room. And through it all, I watched them. Daniel. Relaxed. Confident. Certain. Natalie. Composed. Controlled, but not as perfectly as before. They believed they were winning. They believed I didn't know. And that belief made them careless. What they didn't know was that this meeting wasn't my weakness. It was part of my timeline. My attorney had already filed documentation. My own evaluation process had already been scheduled. Every piece of evidence I needed was already in place. They thought this was the moment I would lose control. It was the moment I needed them to commit fully. When the session ended, everything felt polite, professional, contained. Daniel stood, looking satisfied. Natalie gathered her things without saying much. I didn't challenge anything. I didn't correct anything. I let them walk out of that room thinking they had already won. I stayed behind for a moment longer, gathering my bag slowly, my movements unhurried. Then I stepped outside. The air felt different. Not lighter. Not heavier. Just clearer. I walked to my car and sat inside, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. My breathing was steady. My thoughts were sharp. I replayed everything. Not emotionally. Analytically. Every word. Every reaction. Every shift. They had crossed a line. Not just in what they planned, but in how far they were willing to go to make it happen. There was no going back from that. I leaned back in the seat, my eyes fixed on the windshield. That was the day they tried to break me, and the moment I knew exactly how I was going to break their plan instead. The day after the evaluation, everything went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, the kind that hides movement. I woke up early, earlier than usual, my mind already clear before my eyes even opened. There was no rush anymore, no urgency, just a steady awareness of what needed to happen next. I moved through the house slowly, making breakfast, checking my phone, responding to messages. Everything looked normal from the outside. That was the point. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything is moving underneath. When I arrived at the hospital, Daniel was sitting up, talking more easily now. His energy noticeably improved. Natalie stood near the window. Her posture relaxed. Her presence no longer cautious. They looked comfortable, confident. I walked in with the same calm expression I had practiced. "How are you feeling today?" I asked. "Better," Daniel said, his voice stronger. "Much better." "That's good," I replied, setting my bag down. That's all that matters. I kept my tone even. Supportive. Uncomplicated. The version of me they expected. And it worked. Daniel began talking more openly than before, his words flowing without hesitation. "We should start thinking about what comes next," he said. "Structuring things properly." I nodded slightly, as if I agreed. "Of course," I said. "We'll figure everything out." The word landed differently now. Natalie shifted slightly, stepping closer. "We just want to make sure everything is stable," she added, her voice smooth. Stable. That word again. They were building something with it. I watched them carefully, not interrupting, letting the conversation unfold. The more comfortable they felt, the more they revealed. Later that afternoon, Daniel handed me a folder. "We should go over this," he said. I took it without hesitation, opening it slowly. Financial restructuring, custody-related provisions, temporary authority transfers, everything presented as practical, necessary, logical. "This is just to make things easier while I recover," he added. Of course it was. I flipped through the pages calmly, my eyes scanning each line without reacting. They weren't asking me to give anything up. They were asking me to sign everything away. I looked up at him and smiled faintly. "Okay," I said. No argument. No resistance. Just agreement. Natalie watched me closely. Too closely. But I didn't give her anything to work with. I picked up the pen. And I signed, not impulsively, not blindly, deliberately. I knew exactly what I was signing. And more importantly, what I wasn't. I handed the folder back without hesitation. "That should take care of things," I said. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. "Good," he said. "That's good." Relief. Real. Unfiltered. Natalie's expression softened slightly. For the first time, they both looked at ease. They believed it was done. They believed they had secured everything. I left the hospital shortly after, my movements unhurried, my expression unchanged. But the moment I stepped outside, I pulled out my phone and made a call. "It's done," I said. My attorney didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. "We're covered," he replied. "Everything is in place." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Before I had signed anything, I had already moved what needed to be moved, protected what needed to be protected, secured what they thought no longer existed. They believed I had nothing left to protect, because they didn't know what I had already moved. I ended the call and sat in my car for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. Another message came through. Confirmation from my accountant. Funds secured. Structures intact. Access limited. Their plan depended on timing. Mine depended on structure. And structure doesn't break under pressure. I leaned back in the seat, closing my eyes briefly. Stopping them now would be easy. Too easy. But it would protect them. Limit exposure. Reduce consequences. No, they needed to go further. They needed to commit. I returned to the hospital the next day, maintaining the same rhythm, the same calm, the same version of myself. Daniel was already discussing next steps. Meetings. Arrangements. Future planning. Natalie was more involved now, speaking more freely, stepping into conversations without hesitation. They were no longer testing the situation. They were executing, and that was exactly what I needed. The more they moved forward, the deeper they locked themselves into what they believed was control. That night, I sat at my dining table again, the same place where everything had begun to unravel. The documents lay in front of me, the ones I had signed, the ones they thought defined the outcome. I looked at them differently, not as losses, but as leverage. Every signature, every clause, every assumption they had made, it all worked in one direction. Theirs. Except for the parts they didn't understand. The parts they didn't read closely enough. The parts they assumed didn't matter. I reviewed my evidence again. Financial records, legal drafts, recorded conversations. Everything aligned. Everything ready. The only thing left was timing. Timing doesn't just decide outcomes. It defines them. I closed the folder slowly, placing it neatly on the table. They believed they were at the end of their plan. They believed they had already won. But the truth was, this was only the beginning of mine. I let them believe they had control. Because the only thing more powerful than control is letting someone think they have it. The conference room was colder than I expected. Not in temperature. In atmosphere. Glass walls. Clean table. Neutral chairs arranged with intention. Everything designed to look balanced. Controlled. Professional. Nothing about it felt neutral. Daniel was already seated when I walked in. His posture relaxed. His expression steady. Natalie sat beside him. Hands folded neatly. Her gaze fixed on the table until I entered. Then she looked up. No surprise. No hesitation. Just quiet acknowledgement. My attorney stood as I approached, pulling out a chair for me. I sat down slowly, placing my folder in front of me. My movements calm, deliberate. Across from us, their attorney adjusted his glasses. Scanning through documents like this was just another case. To them, it probably was. To me, it was the moment everything would end. Daniel leaned forward slightly. His voice measured. I think we can keep this straightforward, he said. We've already outlined the structure. It's just a matter of finalizing it. Finalizing. Like this was already decided. Like I was just here to agree. I nodded once, as if I understood. Go ahead, I said. He continued, laying it out piece by piece. Financial control. Custody arrangements. Authority delegation. Everything presented as reasonable. Necessary. Best for everyone. Natalie didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Every now and then, she gave a small nod, reinforcing his words without saying them herself. They looked aligned. Confident. Certain. I listened without reacting, my hands resting lightly on the table. When he finished, the room fell quiet for a moment. Then all eyes turned to me. I didn't rush. I didn't argue. I simply reached into my folder and placed a set of documents in the center of the table. My attorney said nothing. Daniel glanced at them briefly, his expression unchanged. What's this? He asked. Something you should review before we finalize anything, I replied. He barely looked at the first page. Natalie didn't move. They assumed it didn't matter. They assumed wrong. Before we continue, I said calmly, I just want to confirm something. Daniel leaned back slightly, nodding. Did you review everything you signed? He answered immediately. Of course. No pause. No doubt. Just certainty. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then I nodded slowly. Good. My attorney slid one page forward, tapping a section that had been highlighted. Daniel's eyes dropped to it. At first, nothing changed. Then he leaned in closer. Silence stretched across the table. What is this? He asked, his tone shifting. That, my attorney said evenly, is a clause within the agreement you signed. Daniel frowned, reading more carefully now. It outlines the conditions under which asset control reverts. My attorney continued. Daniel's expression tightened. Reverts to who? He asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He read the line again. And again. Then his eyes lifted slowly. Toward me? No, he said quietly. Not denial. Recognition. They thought they were taking control. My attorney said, his voice steady. But they agreed to a structure that transfers authority under the conditions already triggered. Daniel shook his head slightly, flipping through the pages. This wasn't. Natalie leaned forward, her composure cracking for the first time. "Let me see that," she said sharply. Her voice wasn't controlled anymore. She scanned the document quickly, her eyes moving faster than his. Then she stopped. The room went silent. That was the moment everything stopped moving. The moment the truth caught up with them. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I simply reached into my folder again and placed another set of documents on the table. Transaction logs, trust drafts, communication records. Each one aligned, each one undeniable. Their attorney's posture changed immediately, from relaxed to alert. He reached for the papers, flipping through them with more urgency than before. "Where did you get these?" he asked. I didn't answer, because the question didn't matter. The pattern did. "This indicates prior coordination," my attorney said. "Financial movement, structural preparation, legal positioning." Daniel looked at me, his expression no longer confident. "Jessica," I held up my hand slightly. Not aggressively, just enough. I wasn't here to listen anymore. Natalie shifted in her seat, her earlier control gone. "This doesn't prove anything," she said. But her voice lacked conviction. "It proves enough," my attorney replied calmly. "Enough to challenge every assumption this structure was built on." Their attorney leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he processed everything in front of him. "This changes things," he said quietly. Yes, it did. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his breathing uneven now. This wasn't supposed to. He stopped himself. Too late. For the first time. They weren't working together. They were trying to protect themselves. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to push. Control had already shifted. "I'm not agreeing to your terms," I said calmly. "Not emotional, not reactive, just final." Daniel looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Not as the version he expected, but as something else entirely. Something he hadn't accounted for. The room fell quiet again. No one spoke. No one moved. Because there was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to control. I stood up slowly, gathering my documents, my movement steady. Daniel didn't stop me. Natalie didn't speak. Their attorney didn't object. Silence said everything. As I turned toward the door, I paused for just a second. Not to look back, just to let the moment settle. That was the moment everything they built fell apart. And the moment they realized they had never been ahead of me at all. The silence didn't end when I left the room. It followed me. Through the hallway, into the elevator, out into the open air where the world continued like nothing had changed. But everything had. I stood outside the building for a moment, letting the weight of it settle, not heavily, not painfully, just completely. Behind me, decisions were being rewritten. Structures were collapsing. Conversations were shifting. Not because I raised my voice, not because I fought harder, but because the truth had nowhere left to hide. My attorney stepped beside me a few minutes later, his tone calm. "It's over," he said. I nodded, not in relief, in recognition. It wasn't my voice that ended their plan. It was the weight of what they couldn't undo. Daniel called that evening. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. His voice was different. Not confident. Not controlled. Uncertain. "I didn't know," he said quickly. "I didn't realize what I was signing." I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak. Let him try to piece together something that no longer fit. "I thought it was just temporary," he continued. "I thought we were just trying to protect things." Protect. The word sounded almost ironic now. "You should have read it," I said quietly. There was a pause on the other end. "I trusted," he started. "You trusted what was convenient," I replied. "Not sharp, not angry, just accurate." He exhaled, the sound uneven. "Jessica, we can fix this." I closed my eyes for a moment. Not because I needed to think, but because I didn't. There was nothing left to fix. I'm not trying to fix anything, I said. Silence. Then, softer, almost unfamiliar. He asked. So that's it. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. The evening light stretching across the floor. That was it a long time ago, I said. And I ended the call. Natalie never called. She didn't need to. Her role had already disappeared the moment the structure stopped supporting her. Without it, she had nothing to stand on. No position. No leverage. Just silence. And silence. This time. Wasn't control. It was absence. A few days later, everything became official. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just finalized. Custody remained with me. Financial control secured. Every document aligned with what had already been decided in that room. Real endings don't explode. They settle. I walked back into my house that evening and paused in the doorway. It felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I had, for the first time since everything began, I didn't look at the space and see what I had lost. I saw what remained, and what remained was enough. My son ran toward me from the living room, his small arms wrapping around me without hesitation. Without question, I held him close, grounding myself in something that had never shifted, never been uncertain. In the end, the only thing that mattered was the one thing they couldn't take from me. Later that night, after he had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the quiet. The same quiet that once felt heavy now feeling steady. I thought about everything that had happened. The choices, the timing, the plan that had been built without me, and the way it had fallen apart. Not because I destroyed it, but because I understood it. The hardest part wasn't losing him. It was realizing I had never truly had what I thought I did. And once I accepted that, there was nothing left to hold on to. I didn't rebuild what I had. I built something else. Something quieter. Stronger. Something no one could quietly take from me again. Because the strongest revenge isn't destruction. It's walking away with everything that actually matters. I stood up and walked toward the door, pausing for a second before stepping outside. The air was cool. Still. Uncomplicated. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I didn't walk away empty. I walked away with everything that was ever truly mine. And if you've ever been in a moment where everything felt like it was slipping away, where the people you trusted the most turned into the ones you had to question, just remember this. Sometimes the truth doesn't break you. It gives you back control. If this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever had to choose yourself after being underestimated, I'd really like to hear your story too. Leave a comment. I read everyone. And if you believe quiet strength still matters, stay here with me. Because there are more stories like this. Not louder. Not bigger. Just real. And sometimes, those are the ones that matter the most. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.